The promise of a new life in Redemption Creek, Arizona, had been painted in letters of hope. Beatrice Abernathy, a woman fleeing the suffocating quiet of Boston society, had held those letters from rancher Franklin Hayes like they were scripture. She had studied the photograph he'd sent until the edges were soft with wear. A handsome man, smiling, standing tall before a fine, sturdy ranch house. He had a kind face, a strong face, but the man she found waiting for her was not the man from the letters. He was a ghost, a gaunt, haunted thing living with three starving children in a makeshift camp of rags and scavenged wood. They huddled on the edge of the very town that was meant to be her salvation. As the townsfolk stared, their whispers like the dry rustle of snakes in the dust. A cold fury, not pity, rose in Beatrice's throat. She looked from the broken man to his desperate children, their eyes huge and dark in their thin faces. She straightened her spine, the wool of her traveling suit suddenly feeling like armor. Her voice cut through the dry desert air with a command that would echo through the entire territory, a command that would change everything. "Franklin Hayes," she said, her voice clear and sharp as shattered glass. "Get your children. Get in my wagon now." Beatrice Abernathy felt the dust of Arizona settle into the very weave of her good wool traveling suit. It was a fine, gritty powder that covered everything, a world away from the damp, clean cobblestones of Boston. For 3 brutal days, the stagecoach had rattled her bones and tested her resolve. But the image she held in her mind, the photograph of that handsome, smiling man, had kept her steady. Franklin Hayes, standing proudly before his sturdy-looking ranch house. His letters, penned in a surprisingly elegant hand, had been her lifeline. They spoke of 1,000 acres of prime grazing land, a small but growing herd of cattle, and a deep, aching longing for a partner. A woman of good character and steady heart to share it all with. At 28, Beatrice considered herself past the point of romantic delusion. Her options back in Boston were to wither into a spinster aunt or marry a man twice her age who smelled of mothballs and condescension. She was tired of being an ornament. She wanted to build something real. The mail-order bride advertisement had been a desperate gamble, but Mr. Hayes's words felt genuine. He wasn't looking for a swooning girl. He was looking for a partner. And Beatrice, with a small inheritance her father had wisely invested for her, was ready to be that partner. The stagecoach lurched to a final, jarring halt in the center of Redemption Creek. The town itself seemed caught in a deep sigh, not quite sure if it was dying or being born. A few solid-looking buildings, a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, lined a wide, dusty street. The rest were weather-beaten shacks and tents clinging to the edges, like nervous newcomers clinging to a promise. Beatrice gathered her handbag, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had told Mr. Hayes to meet her at the stagecoach depot. Her eyes scanned the small crowd of onlookers. Leathery-faced prospectors, a few tired-looking women in faded calico, some swaggering cowboys. No one looked anything like the man from the photograph, not even close. Then a young boy, maybe 10 years old, broke away from the shadows and approached the stagecoach driver. "Mister, you got a lady on board? A Miss Abernathy." "That I do, son," the driver grunted, gesturing with his thumb toward Beatrice. The boy's eyes, a startlingly clear blue, widened as he took in her refined city attire. He was painfully thin, wearing trousers that were far too short and a shirt that had been patched more times than she could count. He looked from her to a spot on the far edge of town, and a flicker of pure dread crossed his face. "I'm Beatrice Abernathy," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "Are you here on behalf of Mr. Franklin Hayes?" The boy swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the dirt at his feet. "I'm Samuel Hayes, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My pa. He's over yonder. He asked me to fetch you." Beatrice followed the boy's gaze. It wasn't to a wagon or a horse or the shaded porch of the general store. It was to a desolate patch of sun-scorched earth just beyond the last dilapidated structure. There, huddled in the meager shade of a mesquite tree, was a makeshift camp. A tattered blanket stretched over a few branches to create a lean-to. A blackened pot sat over a cold fire pit. And there was her Mr. Hayes. The man who stood as she approached was a specter of the one in the photograph. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a deep-carved shame that seemed to weigh down his entire frame. His hair was matted, his face covered in a ragged beard, and the clothes on his back were threadbare and stained. Two smaller children, a boy of about 7 and a girl no older than 5, clung to his legs, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. They were all so thin. The world seemed to tilt beneath Beatrice's feet. This wasn't a setback. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a catastrophe. Her dream of a partnership, of building a new life, crumbled into Arizona dust right before her eyes. The whispers from the townsfolk on the main street were now a palpable wave of pity and scorn rolling toward her. Franklin Hayes couldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the ground, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Miss Abernathy," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse and despair, "there's there's been a change in my circumstances. I I understand. If you want to take the next stagecoach back, I'll not hold you to our agreement." Beatrice looked at him, at the ghost of the man from the letters, the shadow of pride still visible in the set of his shoulders. Then she looked at the children. Samuel, the oldest, stood stiffly, his chin jutted out in a pathetic attempt at defiance, trying to shield his family from her judgment. The younger boy, Daniel, hid his face completely in his father's trousers. And the little girl, Rose, with wide, hungry eyes, peered out at Beatrix with a heartbreaking curiosity. Something inside Beatrix snapped. It wasn't the delicate spring of a Boston socialite. It was the cold, hard steel of an ancestor who had crossed an ocean with nothing but a prayer and a fistful of courage. She had not endured 3 days on a rumbling stagecoach, pinned all her hopes on this one last chance, and abandoned everything she knew, only to be turned back by this raw, humiliating injustice. The townsfolk were still watching. Let them watch. She turned to the stagecoach driver, who was unloading her trunk with a grim expression. "You there, put that trunk in the back of my wagon." The driver looked utterly confused. "Ma'am, what wagon?" Beatrice's eyes scanned the street. Her gaze landed on a sturdy buckboard wagon for sale outside the livery stable. A sign scribbled on a piece of wood read, $20. It was nearly all the cash she had on her person, but her inheritance was waiting safely at the bank. Without a word, she marched directly to the liveryman. "I'm buying that wagon." She pulled the bills from her reticule without haggling. Then she marched to the general store, the onlookers parting before her like the Red Sea. Inside, she bought a large sack of flour, beans, salted pork, coffee, and 3 colorful sticks of hard candy. When she returned, the liveryman was hitching a rented mule to her newly purchased wagon. She had her trunk loaded in the back alongside the provisions. She walked back to the edge of town, her heels sinking into the soft dirt. Franklin Hayes and his children hadn't moved. They watched her as if she were an apparition, a mirage in the heat. He looked utterly defeated, expecting her to deliver the final, crushing blow of her departure. Beatrice stopped directly in front of him. Her face was set like granite. She ignored the murmurs, the stares, the entire world. Her focus narrowed to the 4 broken souls before her. Her voice was not a suggestion. It was not a plea. It was a command forged in the fires of her own desperation and a sudden, shocking wellspring of protective fury. "Franklin Hayes," she said, her voice clear and ringing across the dusty expanse. "Get your children. Get in my wagon now." Franklin looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Hope, a thing he'd thought long dead, flickered painfully in their depths. The little girl Rose looked at her father, then at the candy sticks Beatrix held in her hand, and took a single hesitant step forward. Beatrice didn't wait for an answer. She turned her back on him and walked to the driver's seat of her new wagon, her posture as straight and unyielding as a general taking command of a battlefield. She had no plan. She had no home. She had just spent nearly all her money on a man who had deceived her, in a wagon she didn't know how to drive. But for the first time in her life, Beatrix Abernathy felt truly, terrifyingly in charge of her own destiny. The wagon ride was a study in the stunned silence. Beatrix gripped the reins with a white-knuckled intensity, navigating the mule away from the gawking eyes of the town center and toward the sparse outskirts. Franklin sat beside her, rigid with a mixture of shame and bewildered gratitude that seemed to choke him. In the back, Samuel, Daniel, and Rose were huddled together, clutching the provisions like precious jewels. Rose was methodically licking a red candy stick, her wide, serious eyes fixed on the back of Beatrice's head, as if she were a strange and powerful angel. Beatrix had no destination in mind, only a desperate, clawing need for privacy. Away from the whispers, away from the pity. A mile out of town, she spotted a small, abandoned miner's cabin, little more than 4 crumbling adobe walls and a partial roof. It was derelict, but it was shelter. "We'll stay here for tonight," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the sun bled orange and purple across the vast horizon, a small fire crackled in the cabin's dilapidated hearth. The smell of frying salt pork and coffee filled the small space, a scent so alien and luxurious to the Hayes family that the children watched the skillet with a hypnotic reverence. Beatrix moved with a brisk, no-nonsense efficiency that masked the tempest raging in her soul. She wasn't playing house. She was securing a perimeter, building a fortress against despair. After they had eaten, the children devouring their portions with a quiet, desperate speed that tore at Beatrice's heart, they fell asleep on a bed of blankets she had bought. Only then did she finally turn to Franklin. He sat on an overturned crate, staring into the fire, the light flickering across a face that seemed to have aged a decade in the last year. "The letters, Mr. Hayes," Beatrix began, her voice low but firm as steel. "They spoke of a ranch, Hayes's Hollow, 1,000 acres, a fine house." Franklin flinched as if she had struck him. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not the cunning of a liar, but the profound, bottomless agony of a man who had lost everything. "It was all true, Miss Abernathy," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "Every word of it. When I wrote to you, I was a proud man, a prosperous man." He took a shaky breath. "My wife, Martha, she passed from fever 2 winters ago. It was hard, so hard. The children needed a mother. The ranch needed a woman's touch. I, I was lonely. I saw your notice and it felt like a sign from Providence. You sounded so strong, so capable." "What happened to the ranch?" Beatrix pressed. Her curiosity was no longer about his deceit. It was a burning need to understand the chasm between the letters and the reality before her. How could a man fall so far, so fast? Franklin's face hardened, his voice filling with a venom that had long since curdled into despair. "One man." The name sounded like a threat. A curse spat into the fire. "His name is Bartholomew Thorne. He arrived in the territory about a year ago, came from back east, they say, with more money than God. He started buying up land, water rights, anything he could get his hands on. He has a way about him, charming on the surface, but underneath, he's a rattlesnake." Franklin leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. "Thorne wanted Hayes's Hollow. My land has the best water source in this valley. The Redemption River flows right through the northern pasture. He made me an offer, a low one. I refused. My father homesteaded that land. I was born in that house. I meant to die there." "So he forced you out," Beatrice surmised. Franklin let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Worse, he was clever. The winter was hard and I lost some cattle. I needed a small loan to buy new stock and see me through to spring. The bank in Redemption, run by a man in Thorne's pocket, turned me down flat. Then, like a savior from on high, Thorne himself appears, offers me a personal loan. The terms seemed fair. I was desperate, so I signed the papers." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was painful to watch. "I didn't read the fine print. My Martha, she was the one who handled the books. I'm a rancher, Miss Abernathy, not a lawyer." Buried in the legal jargon was a clause, an impossible repayment schedule. If I missed a single payment by a single day, the entire loan was due immediately. If I couldn't pay, the deed to my ranch was the collateral. The trap had been laid with meticulous, predatory cruelty. A week before the first payment was due, my prize bull was found dead, poisoned. Then a small fire in my barn destroyed a portion of my hay stores. Accidents, Sheriff Brody called them. But I knew. I knew it was Thorne's men, making sure I couldn't make the payment. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I missed the deadline by 12 hours. The next morning, Sheriff Brody and two of Thorne's hired guns were on my porch with a court order. They gave me 1 hour to vacate. The land, the house, the cattle, the furniture, everything. It all belonged to Bartholomew Thorne. Beatrix felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't a story of misfortune. It was a tale of calculated, systematic destruction. A man being erased. They threw us out with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Franklin continued, his voice cracking. The townsfolk. They're scared of Thorne. He owns the bank, has the sheriff on his payroll, and employs half the cowboys in the valley. No one would help me. No one would give me work. We've been living like this for 4 months. He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with unshed tears of shame. I kept writing to you, telling you to delay your trip, making excuses. I was a coward. I kept hoping for a miracle, that I could somehow fix it before you arrived. Then my last bit of money ran out, and I couldn't even afford the postage. I just prayed you wouldn't come. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling fire and the soft, innocent breathing of the sleeping children. Beatrix stared at the man before her. The anger she had felt on the street was gone, replaced by a cold, clear, terrifying understanding. She had not been tricked by a simple liar. She had stumbled into a war. Franklin Hayes was a casualty, a man who had been systematically dismantled and left for dead on the side of the road. And Bartholomew Thorne was the architect of his ruin, the general of the opposing army. Beatrix stood up and walked to the cabin's small, grimy window, looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. She had come west seeking a partnership, a chance to build. She looked back at the sleeping forms of Samuel, Daniel, and Rose. She looked at their broken father. The partnership she had envisioned was a phantom. The life of a comfortable rancher's wife was a dream that had died the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. In its place was something raw and dangerous. She could leave. She had every right. Her inheritance was safe in the bank in town. She could buy a ticket back to Boston and pretend this nightmare never happened, pretend she never saw those children's hungry eyes. But the image of Bartholomew Thorne, a man she'd never even met, rose in her mind. A smug, faceless villain who crushed good men for sport and profit. The thought of him sitting in Franklin's house, on Franklin's land, while these children starved, it ignited a fire within her. It was the same fierce protective instinct that had made her buy the wagon. She had not run from the stifling prison of Boston society just to run from this. She turned back from the window. Her decision was made. It was reckless. It was insane. It was, she suspected, the first truly important decision of her entire life. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice devoid of pity, filled instead with a steely resolve that made him look up in shock. You will stop calling me Miss Abernathy. My name is Beatrix, and you will get some sleep. Tomorrow we begin to fight back. For the second time that day, Franklin Hayes looked at this woman from the east as if she were a creature from another world. But this time, the flicker of hope in his eyes did not die. It caught and it held like a fragile ember in the dark. The next morning, Beatrice awoke to a world painted in the stark, unforgiving light of the Arizona sun. Her first act was not one of despair, but of defiance. She took a portion of her dwindling cash and, leaving Franklin to watch the children, walked the mile back into Redemption Creek. Her stride was purposeful, her chin held high, daring the whispers and stares to challenge her. Her first stop was the office of Sheriff Brody. It was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. The sheriff himself was a large man, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, a silver star pinned crookedly upon it. A shiny new gold pocket watch was chained to his belt, an item that seemed far too opulent for a small-town lawman's salary. Beatrix laid out Franklin's story in concise, clear terms, omitting none of the details about the suspicious accidents or the predatory nature of the loan. She spoke with the authority of a woman who expected to be heard, not a victim asking for a handout. Sheriff Brody listened with a placid, almost bored expression, polishing his badge with his thumb. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low drawl laced with false sympathy, "I surely do feel for Mr. Hayes's predicament. I do. But what you're describing is a legal transaction. A contract was signed. Mr. Hayes failed to meet his obligations. Mr. Thorne was well within his rights to foreclose on the property. My hands are tied. And the poisoned bull, the barn fire? Beatrix countered, her eyes narrowing. Are those not criminal matters worth investigating? Unfortunate incidents, ma'am, Brawdy said, waving a dismissive hand. This is rough country. Things happen. Without witnesses or evidence, it's just one man's word against another's. And Mr. Thorne, well, he's a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. The sheriff's gaze was flat and unyielding. It was like talking to a stone wall. Beatrix saw then that he wasn't a public servant. He was a gatekeeper, and the gate was firmly, irrevocably shut. Arguing further would be pointless. She had confirmed what Franklin had told her. The law in Redemption Creek served one man, and his name was Bartholomew Thorne. Frustrated but not defeated, Beatrix's next stop was the general store. She needed more supplies, but she was also fishing for something else entirely, an ally, even a silent one. The store was run by a woman in her late 50s named Martha, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands that were never still. She watched Beatrix with a cautious neutrality as she selected her goods. Other customers in the store fell silent when Beatrice entered, watching her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They were like mice who had seen a new cat in the barn. Heard you took in the Hayes family, Martha said quietly, weighing a sack of beans. Her voice wasn't unkind, merely stating a fact, but her eyes were searching. They needed help, Beatrix replied simply, meeting her gaze. Folks around here are careful, Martha said, her eyes flicking toward the other customers. Mr. Thorne provides a lot of jobs, puts a lot of money into this town. People don't like to cross him. Even when he destroys a man and leaves his children to starve? Beatrix asked, her voice carrying just enough to make the other patrons shift uncomfortably. Martha finished weighing the beans and looked Beatrix square in the eye. It's a hard truth, miss. My own husband, George, he had a small freight business. Thorne offered to buy him out. George refused. A month later, 2 of our wagons had broken axles in the same week. Freak accidents, the sheriff said. Ruined us. George, he lost heart. Died not long after. The confession was dropped like a stone in a still pond, a quiet testament to a shared enemy. You're a stranger here, Martha continued, her voice dropping lower. You don't know how he operates. I'm learning quickly, Beatrice said, paying for her items. As she was about to leave, Martha leaned over the counter, her voice barely a whisper. A piece of advice free of charge. Thorne may own the sheriff, but he doesn't own everyone's memory. Old man Hemlock, the town's first lawyer, retired years ago. He hates Thorne. Says he's a blot on the territory. Hemlock's mostly drunk these days, but his mind is still sharp as a tack when he's sober. Lives in that little house behind the church. Might be worth talking to. Might not. It wasn't just a tip, it was a weapon. A tiny crack in the wall of silence. Beatrice found the house easily enough. It was a ramshackle cottage with a garden long since surrendered to weeds. She knocked on the door, and after a long moment it creaked open to reveal a man who looked as ancient as the desert itself. Alistair Hemlock was skeletally thin, with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that burned with a fierce, if somewhat faded, intelligence. The smell of whiskey hung heavy in the air around him like a shroud. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice gravelly. Beatrice introduced herself and once again told her story. This time, however, she framed it not as a plea for help, but as a request for information, an intellectual puzzle. When she mentioned Bartholomew Thorne, a flicker of profound personal loathing crossed his face. He invited her in. The interior of the cottage was a chaotic mess of books, legal papers, and empty bottles. He motioned for her to sit and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. Thorne, Hemlock slurred, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He's a new breed of vulture. Not content to pick the bones, he kills the animal first. He uses the law not as a shield, but as a club. I've seen his contracts. They're ironclad monstrosities designed to fail. He took a long, shaky swallow. He's the man who ruined me. Had me disbarred on a trumped-up charge of mishandling funds 20 years ago, back in Philadelphia. A lie, of course. But he had the judges in his pocket even then. He destroyed my name, so I came west to forget it. So there's no legal recourse? The contract is unbreakable? Beatrix asked, her heart sinking. As it's written, airtight, Hemlock confirmed. But, he leaned forward, his old eyes seeming to see right through her prim exterior to the steel beneath. Every fortress has a weakness. You just have to find the right crack to place the dynamite. The problem isn't the contract Franklin Hayes signed. The problem is Bartholomew Thorne himself. A man that crooked doesn't start yesterday. He has a history, a past. And men like that, they always leave a trail of skeletons. He drained his glass and slammed it down on the table with a crack. Think, woman. Thorne didn't just take the ranch. He took every piece of paper associated with it. The deed, the ledgers, the account books. Why? A man that confident in his legal standing shouldn't need to hide the history of the property. The gears in Beatrix's mind began to turn, grinding with a new and dangerous idea. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Hemlock said, a sly, almost mad grin touching his lips, that somewhere in the papers he seized from the Hayes Ranch, there might be something he doesn't want anyone to see, something that has nothing to do with the current loan, but everything to do with the history of that land, something that might give you leverage. He let out a wheezing cackle that turned into a cough. He thinks he stole a ranch. Maybe, just maybe, he accidentally stole a hangman's noose along with it. Beatrix left Alistair Hemlock's cottage with the old lawyer's dangerous idea taking root in her mind. The legal path was blocked. The court of public opinion was closed. But the grizzled, whiskey-soaked lawyer had given her a new map. It didn't lead to a courthouse. It led back to Hayes's Hollow, back into the Dragon's Den itself. She now understood that to get the ranch back, she couldn't appeal to the law. She had to find a way to break the man who had bent it to his will. Returning to the desolate adobe cabin, she found Franklin attempting to teach Samuel how to carve a piece of wood into a bird. It was a small, quiet act of fatherhood that stood in stark defiance of their grim circumstances. Daniel was chasing a lizard, and Rose was arranging pebbles into a neat circle. For a fleeting, painful moment, they looked like a family. That evening, as the children slept, Beatrice shared what she had learned. Sheriff Brody's dismissal, Martha's tragic story, and Alistair Hemlock's cryptic, vengeful advice. She watched Franklin's face as she spoke. The hope she had kindled the night before seemed to dim as she described the ironclad nature of Thorne's contract. So it's hopeless, he said, his voice flat with defeat. The law can't touch him. The law as it stands, no, Beatrix corrected, leaning forward into the firelight, her voice urgent. But Mr. Hemlock said something that struck me. He asked why Thorne would be so thorough, why he would take every single piece of paper from your office. Not just the deed, but old ledgers, account books, everything. Franklin frowned, thinking back. His men were like locusts. They cleared out my desk, the lockbox where I kept the deed. They took it all, said it was all part of the property's assets. I was too stunned to argue. Hemlock believes Thorne wasn't just securing his new asset, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He believes Thorne might have been hiding something. Something from the past that was in those papers. Something he was afraid of. Franklin looked at her, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tried to cast his mind back, to picture the contents of the office he had been so violently ejected from. It was a painful exercise, like willingly touching a hot stove. My wife Martha, he said slowly, she handled all the paperwork. She was meticulous. She kept everything. Records going back to when my father first staked his claim. Land surveys, water rights filings, bank statements, receipts for every bull bought and every bushel of corn sold. His voice trailed off. Think, Franklin, Beatrix urged, her intensity palpable. Was there anything unusual? Anything your wife ever mentioned? Any dispute? Any old grudge? Any document that seemed particularly important to her? Franklin closed his eyes, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his face. He sifted through years of memories, the mundane and the meaningful jumbled together. He remembered Martha at the desk, her brow furrowed in concentration, the scratch of her pen late into the night. She had always been so protective of their family's legacy. Then a flicker, a memory. It wasn't a document, it was a conversation. "My father," Franklin said, his eyes snapping open. "Before he passed, he got into a business dealing that went sour with a speculator from back east, a man who wanted to partner with him on buying up a huge tract of land adjacent to ours. My father put up the initial capital. The man was supposed to secure the patents, but he vanished. Took my father's money with him." "Did this man have a name?" Beatrix asked, leaning in even closer, her heart starting to pound. I I don't think my father ever told me his full name. He was too ashamed. Just called him that slick charlatan from Philadelphia. It nearly broke him. He lost a fortune. It's why he was always so cautious afterward." A cold, terrible suspicion began to form in Beatrice's mind. A connection so dark and perfect, it couldn't be a coincidence. "And your wife, Martha? Did she know about this?" Franklin nodded. "She knew everything. She hated that story. Said it was a stain on our family's honor. That the man was never brought to justice. A few months before she got sick, she was organizing my father's old papers. She found his journal, the one detailing the entire swindle. She was furious all over again." He paused, his eyes growing wide with a dawning, horrified realization. She said, she said, "The proof is right here, Franklin, in his own hand. If that man ever shows his face in this territory again, this ledger will be his ruin." "The ledger," Beatrix breathed, the words hanging in the air. "Did you ever see it?" "Yes," Franklin said, his voice gaining strength as the memory solidified. "It was a small, black, leather-bound book. My father's handwriting was very distinct. Martha, she was so proud to have found it. She said it was as good as a signed confession." "And where did she keep it?" Beatrice's heart was a hammer against her ribs. Franklin's face fell. "In the lockbox, with the deed to Hayes's Hollow and our other important papers. She always said the most valuable things should be kept together." The lockbox, the one Thorne's men had taken. The silence that followed was thick with implication. It was a wild, desperate theory, but it fit together with a terrifying logic. A swindler from Philadelphia who vanishes. A man named Bartholomew Thorne who appears years later from the East with a fortune of unknown origin. The same man who ruined Alistair Hemlock in that very city. A man obsessed with acquiring one specific ranch, a ranch whose previous owner he had swindled years before. He wasn't just buying land. He was bearing a crime. He had taken the ranch to silence the ghosts of his past, and in his haste, he had taken the very proof of that past with it. "He has it," Beatrice said, the certainty of it chilling her to the bone. "Thorne has the ledger. He probably doesn't even realize what it is. Just another old book in a box full of papers he's likely stashed away somewhere in the ranch house and forgotten about." Suddenly, the path forward, while impossibly dangerous, was crystal clear. They couldn't fight Thorne in a courtroom. They couldn't fight him with fists. They had to fight him with his own history. They had to retrieve that ledger. "We have to get back into that house," Beatrix declared. Franklin stared at her, the full weight of her words sinking in. She was proposing a crime, a burglary, an infiltration into the fortress of the man who held absolute power over their lives. It was madness. It was suicide. He looked at his sleeping children, their frail bodies a testament to his failure. Then he looked at this woman, and this stranger, who had appeared out of nowhere, and who possessed more fire and fight than he'd felt in a year. The despair that had been his constant companion was finally, mercifully being burned away by the heat of her resolve. For the first time since he'd been thrown off his own land, Franklin Hayes felt the stirrings of a plan, a terrifying, desperate, and righteous plan. "The house has a root cellar," he said, his voice low and steady. "The outside entrance is at the back, hidden by overgrown lilac bushes. Thorne won't even know it's there. It leads up into the kitchen pantry." Beatrice met his gaze across the fire. In that moment, they were no longer a mail-order bride and a failed rancher. They were conspirators, partners not in building a life of comfort, but in orchestrating a feat of impossible justice. 3 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon, The desert was a landscape of deep shadows and hushed sounds. Beatrice and Franklin left the three sleeping children in the dubious safety of the locked adobe cabin, a jug of water and a plate of biscuits beside them. It was a choice that felt like tearing a part of themselves away, but the risk of taking them was far greater. They moved on foot, sticking to the arroyos and gullies, the terrain Franklin knew as well as the back of his own calloused hand. He moved with a grim purpose, the hesitancy and despair stripped from him, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man on his own territory, even if it was his no longer. Beatrix, in a practical dark skirt and blouse, followed silently, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every rustle of a bush, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of pure fear through her. After an hour of tense, silent walking, the familiar silhouette of the ranch house rose against the star-dusted sky. Lights glowed in the downstairs windows. A lone cowboy, one of Thorne's men, sat on the porch, smoking a cigarette, his rifle leaning against the railing. "My office is on the ground floor at the front of the house," Franklin whispered, his breath clouding in the cool night air. "That's where he'll have the lockbox if he even kept it." "He kept it," Beatrix whispered back with a certainty she didn't fully feel. "A man like that is a pack rat of power. He wouldn't throw away the symbol of his victory." They circled wide, using the barn and the outbuildings for cover until they reached the back of the house. Just as Franklin had described, a thick, untamed tangle of lilac bushes grew against the foundation. He pushed aside the branches, revealing a pair of weathered, slanted wooden doors set into the ground. With excruciating slowness, Franklin lifted the iron handle. It let out a groan that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the stillness of the night. They both froze, listening, their bodies tensed for the shout of discovery. From the front of the house, they heard nothing but the chirping of crickets. Franklin lifted the door and slipped into the darkness below. Beatrix followed, her hands scraping against the rough stone walls as she descended the steep steps. He pulled the cellar door almost closed, leaving only a crack of starlight. The air in the root cellar was cool and damp, thick with the smell of earth and aging apples. Franklin lit a small stub of a candle he'd brought. Its flickering light revealed shelves lined with dusty jars, Martha's preserves untouched, and bins of shriveled potatoes. It was a ghost of their former life, and the sight of it caused a visible pang of anguish to cross Franklin's face. He pushed the pane aside and led her to the far wall, to a set of steep wooden stairs leading up. "The pantry," he mouthed. They ascended, each step creaking in protest. The door at the top was unlocked. Franklin put his ear to it, listening for long seconds before slowly, carefully turning the knob. The door opened into the darkness of the kitchen pantry. The main kitchen beyond was dark, but they could hear the low murmur of voices from the front of the house. Thorne and his foreman, likely. They were inside. Tiptoeing across the cold flagstones of the kitchen, they peered around the door frame into the main hall. A single lamp was lit, casting a long, dancing shadow down the corridor. The door to Franklin's old office was slightly ajar. This was the most dangerous part. They had to cross the open, lamplit hall to get to the office. Franklin held up a hand, signaling for her to wait. He listened, timing the cadence of the voices from the front room. When one of the men laughed loudly, a coarse, booming sound, Franklin seized the moment. He darted across the hall and melted into the shadows of the office doorway. Beatrice's heart leaped into her throat. She gathered her skirts, took a deep breath, and followed, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished wooden floor. The office was just as Franklin had left it, but now it felt alien, desecrated by another man's presence. A heavy mahogany desk, Thorne's, dominated the room. A half-empty glass of brandy and a lit cigar, smoldering in an ashtray, told them Thorne had been here very recently. Their eyes scanned the room frantically, and then they saw it. Tucked unceremoniously under a side table, covered in a thin layer of dust, was the familiar black metal lockbox. Franklin knelt beside it, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the lock. "It's a simple lock. Martha always said a strong box was only as good as its hiding place. I can pick this." He pulled a thin piece of wire from his pocket, a trick he'd learned for mending fences, and began to work at the lock. Beatrix stood guard at the door, her ears straining, every nerve alight. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The low murmur of voices from the other room continued, a terrifying soundtrack to their heist. Finally, a soft click echoed in the small room. Franklin lifted the lid. Inside, just as he'd remembered, was a stack of papers. The official deed to Hayes's Hollow lay on top. Beneath it were surveys, old receipts, and then his breath caught a small black leather-bound book. He lifted it out. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it to a random page. Even in the dim candlelight, his father's cramped, forceful handwriting was unmistakable. They had it. Suddenly, the voices from the front room grew louder. A chair scraped against the floor. "We have to go," Beatrix hissed, her eyes wide with panic. Franklin grabbed the ledger, shoved it inside his shirt, and quickly closed the lockbox lid. They didn't have time to put it back in place. They scurried from the office back across the hall and into the kitchen. Just as they slipped into the dark sanctuary of the pantry, they heard heavy footsteps entering the hallway. "I'll get some more brandy," a gruff voice said. It was Thorne's foreman, a man named Cobb. They froze behind the pantry door, not daring to breathe. They could hear Cobb moving around the kitchen, the clink of a decanter against glass. He was mere feet away from their hiding place. Beatrix could feel the frantic beating of Franklin's heart against her back. Or perhaps it was her own. Cobb lingered, pouring the drink. Then, to their absolute horror, his heavy footsteps headed directly for the pantry. The doorknob began to turn. Beatrice's mind raced. They were trapped. Discovery was seconds away. Just as the knob clicked, a shout came from the front of the house. "Cobb, get in here! Riders approaching!" Cobb grunted in annoyance. The doorknob stopped turning. His footsteps receded, moving quickly out of the kitchen. They didn't wait for a second chance. They scrambled down the pantry stairs, through the root cellar, and out into the cool night air, Franklin clutching the ledger to his chest like a prayer. They ran, not looking back, their lungs burning, adrenaline singing in their veins. They didn't stop until the lights of the ranch house were a faint, malevolent glow in the distance. Huddled behind a rock formation, gasping for breath, Franklin finally pulled the ledger from his shirt. Beatrix held the candle stub as he opened it. The book wasn't just a journal, it was a meticulously kept record of his father's business dealings. And there it was, a section spanning several pages, dated 1870. It detailed a partnership agreement to purchase federal lands. It listed the cash contribution from his father, Jonathan Hayes, and it listed the duties of his partner, described as a smooth-talking gentleman from Philadelphia, a Mr. B. Thorne. The twist, the detail that made Beatrice's blood run cold, was on the final page of the entry. It was a promissory note, an addendum to their informal agreement, promising to repay Jonathan Hayes his full investment plus interest within 5 years. And at the bottom, scrawled in an arrogant, looping script, was a signature. It read, clear as day, Bartholomew Thorne. It wasn't just a journal entry. It was a signed, dated, and now long overdue promissory note. A legal acknowledgement of a debt, a swindle, a fraud. Alistair Hemlock had been right. In stealing the ranch, Thorne had stolen his own hangman's noose. The possession of the ledger changed everything. The air in the small adobe cabin, once thick with despair, now crackled with a dangerous, hopeful energy. For 2 days they planned, with Alistair Hemlock, sobered by the sheer audacity of their success, acting as their strategist. "A direct confrontation with the sheriff is useless," the old lawyer had rasped, his eyes gleaming with a fire Beatrix hadn't seen before. "Brodie would burn that book before he'd let it see the light of day. A legal filing would get it buried in paperwork until Thorne could make it disappear. No, this isn't a battle for a courtroom. It's a battle for the soul of this town." His plan was simple, audacious, and terrifying. "Sunday morning," Hemlock had declared, "Thorne fancies himself a pious man. He sits in the front pew of the church every week, a pillar of the community. You will confront him not in the shadows but in the open. On the steps of the church, in front of God and everyone. You won't give them the option to look away." And so, on a Sunday morning so bright it hurt the eyes, the plan was set in motion. Beatrice used the last of her funds to buy clean, simple clothes for the children and a new shirt for Franklin from Martha at the general store. Martha, seeing the flinty resolve in Beatrice's eyes, gave her a small, encouraging nod that spoke volumes. As the church bell began its solemn call, the townsfolk of Redemption Creek emerged from their homes dressed in their Sunday best. They moved toward the simple white church at the end of the main street, a weekly ritual of piety and social gathering. Bartholomew Thorne was among them. He was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in a black frock coat, his silvering hair perfectly combed. He walked with an air of unshakable authority, nodding graciously to the citizens who tipped their hats and offered deferential greetings. He was the king in his court, and this was his procession. Just as Thorne placed a polished boot on the bottom step of the church, a new procession appeared at the other end of the street. It was the Hayes family. Franklin Hayes, clean-shaven for the first time in months, walked at the front. The shame and defeat had been burned out of him, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. His shoulders were back, his gaze locked on the man on the church steps. Beside him walked Beatrix Abernathy, her posture ramrod straight, her expression unreadable and severe. She held the small black ledger in her hands. Behind them, holding hands, were Samuel, Daniel, and Rose, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe at their parents' transformation. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. They stopped their ascent into the church, turning to stare at the approaching family. This was not the broken, homeless man and his starving children from the edge of town. This was something else entirely. Thorne turned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome features at this interruption of his Sunday ritual. His eyes narrowed as he recognized Franklin. A contemptuous smirk touched his lips. "Hayes," he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent street, "I believe you're mistaken. This is a place for decent folk. Your kind belongs in the gutter where I left you." Franklin didn't flinch. He stopped 10 feet from the steps, Beatrice and the children forming a silent, unshakable line with him. "I've come for what's mine, Thorne," Franklin said, his voice not loud but clear and steady, resonating with a strength no one had heard from him in a year. Thorne laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You have nothing. The law has seen to that." He glanced at Beatrix. "And you, madam, I'd heard you'd arrived. You hitched your wagon to a broken horse. A foolish choice." "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Beatrix said, her voice cutting through the air like ice. "I believe you are the one who is mistaken. We have not come to discuss the ranch you stole last year. We have come to discuss a debt you incurred 15 years ago." She took a step forward, holding up the black ledger. "Does this look familiar?" "It's the journal of Jonathan Hayes. It contains a detailed account of your partnership with him, and more importantly," she opened the book to the final page of the entry. "It contains a promissory note for a significant sum of money, signed by your own hand." Thorne's smirk vanished. His face went pale. He stared at the book in her hands as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. For the first time, the town saw a crack in Bartholomew Thorne's perfect facade. They saw fear. That is a forgery," he sputtered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "A pathetic fabrication." "Is it?" Beatrix challenged, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of onlookers. "There are men here who knew Jonathan Hayes, who know his handwriting, and I'm sure there are many who would be interested to see the signature of the man who swindled him and left him a broken man." Sheriff Brodie, who had been standing near the church door, began to move forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Now that's enough of this disturbance. This is a private matter." "It stopped being a private matter when you threw this man and his children out on the street to starve." Beatrice's voice rang out, filled with a passion that stunned the crowd into silence. "You all stood by and watched. You whispered, and you looked away because you were afraid. We are not afraid anymore." She looked directly at Thorne, her eyes blazing. "This ledger proves that you are a fraud and a thief, Mr. Thorne. It proves that the very foundation of your wealth in this territory is built upon a crime. You didn't come here to build. You came here to hide." Thorne, seeing the tide of public opinion beginning to shift, the whispers growing louder, made a fatal error. He lunged. He didn't go for a gun. He lunged for the book, his face a mask of raw panic. Franklin, anticipating the move, stepped in front of Beatrix, blocking Thorne's path. The two men stood chest to chest, the simmering hatred between them finally boiling over. "You have nothing," Thorne hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "I have my name back," Franklin snarled, "and I have the truth." From the crowd, a voice called out. It was Old Man Hemlock, standing shakily, pointing a bony finger. "Let's see the book. Let the people be the judge." Another voice, then another, joined in. The wall of fear that Thorne had so carefully constructed around the town was beginning to crumble. Sheriff Brodie looked from the muttering crowd to Thorne's panicked face, and for the first time, his own self-interest seemed to be in question. Siding with a proven swindler against the entire town was a poor political move. The standoff was absolute. The king was on his church steps, but his subjects were no longer bowing. In the center of it all stood Beatrix Abernathy, a woman from Boston, holding a simple leather book that had become the most powerful weapon in the entire territory. Panicked and exposed, Bartholomew Thorne made his final, desperate move. He lunged again, not for the ledger this time, but inside his coat for the derringer he kept hidden. He never cleared the leather. Before his fingers could grasp the handle, a wave of townsmen, men who had respected Franklin's father, men who had been cowed by Thorne for too long, surged forward. One man wrenched Thorne's arm back while another seized the weapon. The fight drained from Thorne in an instant, his authority shattered by the very people he had terrorized. Seeing his patron defeated and surrounded, Sheriff Brodie swiftly switched his allegiance, pushing through the crowd to clap irons on Thorne's wrists, his voice booming with newfound righteousness. The aftermath was swift and decisive, with Old Man Hemlock wielding the ledger like a holy text and the town providing a chorus of testimony. Thorne's criminal enterprise was unraveled. The signed promissory note was undeniable proof of his initial fraud. He was tried, convicted, and his empire of fear dismantled. The predatory contract on Hayes's Hollow was declared null and void. 2 months later, Beatrice stood on the porch of the ranch house, which now truly felt like home. The happy shouts of the children echoed from the yard where they played, their faces full of life, not hunger. Franklin walked up the steps, the weariness gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet strength. He stood beside her, looking out over the land that was once again his. "This life," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a harder road than the one I promised in my letters." Beatrice thought of her former life in Boston, a gilded cage of quiet desperation. She looked at the thriving children, the reclaimed land, and the honorable man standing beside her. A genuine smile touched her lips. "Franklin," she said, her voice full of a certainty that warmed the air between them. "This is a better one." He met her gaze, and in that shared look of respect and affection, a true partnership was finally sealed. Not by a mail-order promise, but by the unshakable foundation of all they had endured and rebuilt together. And so the story of Beatrix Abernathy and Franklin Hayes became a legend in the Arizona Territory. It wasn't a fairy tale of a damsel in distress being rescued by a handsome rancher. It was the gritty, real-life story of how a woman's unexpected strength became the catalyst that saved a family, exposed a tyrant, and gave an entire town its courage back. Beatrice didn't just get in the wagon. She took the reins and drove an entire community toward its own redemption. Her story reminds us that true strength often comes from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be a victim and instead choose to fight. If this story of incredible resilience and frontier justice moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a tale of true grit. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the forgotten pages of history. Thank you for listening.